If you are like me, there are events or moments in your life that we'd like to have a do-over, because then the next time you could avoid hurting someone you loved. I'll give you an example. When I was growing up, my parents seldom displayed affection in front of me or my three sisters. They were of a generation that considered public displays of affection to be inappropriate, and I believe that carried over into their home life to some extent. And they didn't hold hands. The kisses we saw were just pecks on the cheek, really. And even those were reserved for special occasions, birthdays, holidays, anniversaries. Their romance, their endearment for each other were private, just for them. My parents were married in 1942 during the first 10 months or so of World War II. And I believe the war pushed them together by scaring them that they would be separated. Their courtship, I'm convinced, was a bit rocky because of my grandmother, Grammy, an old world Italian woman, matronly woman. She didn't fully appreciate my mother. And I want to be clear about this. It was not because my mother was Irish. It was because she wasn't Italian. A little difference there. So as I said, they married in 1942, and by the time my first sister was born, my father's anti-aircraft battalion was en route to Tunisia. And for the next 2 years, the only contact my parents had was through the letters they wrote to each other. And all of those letters were written on V-mail. That's V for victory. V-mail. Now, the V-mail process was interesting. It was developed to save precious cargo space for war materials. And the process was simply, you got a form, and the forms were available at stateside post offices and distributed throughout the armed forces. You wrote the letter on the form. It was shipped off to be photographically reduced and put on microfilm. And it did save a lot of space. With the V-mail process, you could get 150,000 letters into one mail bag. So it saved a lot of space. And of course, the letters were enlarged before delivery. They kind of looked like sepia prints. In 1956, my sisters and I, while playing in our basement, discovered a trove of these letters from my father to my mother. They were in a small barrel that was sealed. I guess it had always been there near the 100-gallon oil tank that fed the furnace. And we opened it up, and we found these strange, they looked like pictures of letters. We didn't know what they were, and we realized they were from my father to my mother, and written during the war. It took us a while to decipher his cramped handwriting. He wasn't writing under the best of circumstances at all times. And what really amazed us was the romantic language and the terms of endearment he used for my mother and my sister. I mean, pet names. My father. This was a side of him with which we were not acquainted. And it was wonderful, but we thought it was hysterical. We read them as kids and in these sing-song voices, and we were laughing uproariously, and our laughter was interrupted by our mother who was calling us to dinner, and we grabbed some letters and we ran upstairs, and we're just babbling on about what we'd found. Our parents didn't know what we were talking about. My father was at his usual place at the head of the table. My mother was putting the food on the table. And they did not know what we had found until we started to read the letters at the dinner table in those sing-songy voices, pointing out grammatical errors, misspellings, and laughing at the pet names. Now, my parents were impassive for a few moments, and then my mother just violently pushed the chair away from the table and said, "Those are mine." She reached out, we held up the letters, she grabbed them in a careless embrace and took them to the basement. A minute or two later, we could hear her come upstairs from the basement, but she didn't return to the table. I waited a couple of minutes and went outside to see where she was, and I could see Mom in the backyard watching as 10 feet in front of her, the barrel of love letters burned.